Welcome everyone to the third seminar of Hillary term entitled The Balkan Route, Humanitarian Security Perspective on Migration. This seminar series, co-convened by Othon Anastasakis, Jesse Barton from Sova, and David Madden, addresses security challenges affecting the region of Southeast Europe. Among other things, new forms of geopolitical challenges are analyzed, such as migration, and the ways these challenges affect the region's stability. Our seminar today will focus on the migration security nexus in the so-called Balkan Route, and specifically on the management of reception centers, the criminalisation of migration, and also the role and the profile of smugglers. It is a great pleasure indeed to welcome Dr. Amanda Russell Beattie, Dr. Gemma Bird, and Dr. Myriam Fotou. Amanda Russell Beattie is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University, Birmingham. She writes on international ethics and subjective methodologies within the social sciences, and her work has been published in top journals within the field. She is the co-founder of the British International Studies Association Working Group on Emotions and International Relations, and is a member of the Aesthetics IR research team facilitating research on refugees along the Balkan Route. She's currently writing an autoethnography of being deported from the UK. Gemma Bird, sitting next to me, joined the University of Liverpool Department of Politics in 2017 as a lecturer in politics and international relations. Previously, she worked as a teaching associate at Aston University and as associate lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. She graduated with a PhD from the University of Sheffield in 2016. Her research focused on the foundations of just cross-cultural dialogue in Kant and African political thought. Prior to this, she completed an MA in Research Methods in Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. She teaches political theory and African political thought and politics across a range of modules. Her areas of research specialism also includes citizenship, migration, and aesthetics. And Myriam Fotou is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester. Her research aims at the creation of a distinctive ethics of hospitality, which functions as a way of thinking about the relationship between representation and humanization, of being alert to precarious life, and of responding to the missing other or the unmissed other, i.e. an other who may be present in the Western imagination but who nonetheless does not possess any clear status or agency, who is either illegal, existing in a legal vacuum, or a figure of destitution, liminality. She is currently interested in exploring migrant smuggling and colonial ethics. I would like to ask our speakers to speak approximately 15 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. Amanda, if you would like to start.
First.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. So I've underprepared by 15 minutes because I've always approached it as less is more. So I'll just give you a brief outline of where the paper is going. It's still very much a work in progress, and it is co-authored with Gemma. So I just feel like I need to say that at the beginning because I am speaking for myself today when I'm presenting it. So that's important as well. I guess, first of all, I am by trade an international ethics scholar. I am not an area studies scholar, and I do approach this from the perspective of international relations. And I think that's important just in the way that we framed the paper that I'm presenting to you today, although will be interested to hear your interpretation of what I've said, and I do look forward to the questions that follow. The paper is called Seeking Accountability Through Vulnerability, Ethical Encounters on the Periphery of Refugee Reception Centres. And it's born out of a series of conversations that Gemma, myself, and our two other colleagues who are on the project have had that comes from a deep sense of frustration when you try and understand where you can begin to talk about accountability, and accountability in the way in which the European Union has constructed its policies towards the reception centres, the funding that goes into their creation, their daily management, and the lived experiences on the ground. Because the question that we can never seem to get an answer to is who is accountable? Where does the accountability lie? The paper draws on a series of fieldwork experiences between July 2017 and March 2019. We spent the first round of our fieldwork visiting day centres, talking to people who were providing services and were broadly overwhelmed by what they were doing. We then went back in the summer of 2018 and focused specifically on the reception centres on Chios, Moria and Samos. And then Gemma and I went back in January of 2019 and spent just under a month working and performing research on the island of Samos. So that is the context within which we have done the work. We've tried in our work to balance speaking to people, activists on the ground. We've also tried to engage with people involved at policy creation, policy implementation, so we could get as broad a picture as possible. So a couple of the problems that we speak to in the paper. The first one is, how can we as scholars and as activists engage with the everyday running of the reception centres, but also what it is to live out a period of time within those spaces and the challenges that are presented within that. What theoretical tools can we draw upon to challenge the governance systems around these reception centres, because the gut feeling that prompted this paper was that the ones that are currently in place, and we speak to them in the paper, is that they are slightly broadly problematic. What we witnessed within these spaces obviously is a gross failure of human rights. Most of the work that we now publish, we challenge the notion that this is a refugee crisis, and we actually say that this is a humanitarian crisis. And the paper skips and negotiates between the macro level and the micro level of these debates. And we do that purposely to challenge and intervene in the way in which this particular relationship is conceptualized within the discipline of international relations, especially with an awareness of the micropolitics of an everyday international ethic. So these are the ideas and the questions, rather, that inform the running of the paper. We begin the paper with a conversation about order and disorder. The way in which we begin is that we look at this notion of order as inside and outside, as characterized in the writings of Nicholas Wenger. The idea that sovereignty is a governing principle, and that within the state you have some form of order, and out with the state you have some form of disorder, and that there is within this a hierarchy. And we attach this notion of hierarchy to a patriarchal ordering system. This became really apparent when we were taken in our second bout of fieldwork through the reception centres, and in particular when we were in Vial. What you see here, though, is pictures of Moria camp. The one on the outside, if you follow that white wall down, it says "Welcome to prison." You see the mandate and where the money's coming from in the middle. The bottom hints at the barbed wire, which features quite prominently in all of the reception centres we visited. And then on the other side, I don't know my right and my left, so you're just going to have to guess with me. It says "Welcome," and that's the Olive Grove, the informal space that challenges a lot of these ideas of order. So the literature that we tap into in this first section when we're talking about order, we really draw quite heavily on Castioli's latest publication, because the way in which she describes Moria camp was something that we experienced ourselves. Having to surrender our passports and our identification to be allowed into a 3-meter space. Before we were actually allowed to go through a second demarcation, at which point we were then taken to a waiting area to speak to some officials within that space. What became very clear is that the way in which boundaries were created in all of the reception centres was very much akin to this notion of order that you see playing out in discussions of world order within international relations. And there is broadly this notion that what is trying to be achieved is some form of manageable governance. So the erasure of chaos, the erasure of uncertainty. And you hear this in the repeated narratives of what happens when a new boat arrives, how people are taken through the various processing experiences. It is all about order versus disorder, chaos versus calm. And this is the way in which these centres are geographically laid out. And what we were beginning to notice is that there was a particular violence associated with this. And we thought there was both a physical element to this, but also a structural element. So the first part of the paper speaks to that. What we then go on to do is problematize this. Here, this is Vial Camp on Chios, probably of all the places we've been, my least favourite. This is the corridor that you walk into. It's barbed wires. This camp too is overflowing. If you go beyond the other side of that wall, you see lots of tents that have been erected. Then on the inside of that former military barrack is where it's actually air conditioned, which probably seems slightly inconsequential, but when you're there and it's 40 degrees, it makes a massive difference. Within that space though, again, lots of barriers and boundaries, padlocks, gated areas that you have to walk through and which people are contained for a variety of reasons. And this to us was really quite compelling. So this was a repeated theme that we were seeing as we were out doing our interviews and speaking to people. But what we were witnessing was that there was a way of challenging and problematizing what we were witnessing. And we turned to feminist theories, in particular black feminist theory and women feminists of color, because the way in which they conceptualize the use of space provides an interesting opportunity to challenge the traditional conception of order, as you see portrayed in the writings of people like Nick Renger, but also in what we were witnessing in the fieldwork interviews that we were doing. So we draw on Avtar Bra and her notion of diasporic spaces, and she explains that this space is the intersectionality of diaspora, border, and its dislocation as a point of confluence of economic, political, and cultural and psychic processes. If the circumstances of leaving are important, so too are those of arrival and settling down. And it was this notion of transience and what happens within those spaces and the possibility of dynamic relationships that became quite interesting as we were reading her work, and what that meant and how we could reinterpret what we had observed, the interviews that we'd performed while we were out in the field. One thing that comes into mind is the way in which she discusses vulnerability. And it really flips the notion of vulnerability in the way in which it is used within the reception centres. For example, we would, as we were sitting and talking in Moria camp, actually we were standing in the sun, they wouldn't let us into these spaces. We were having an interview, and what we would learn is that if you were classified as vulnerable, so an unaccompanied minor, women with children without any form of partnership, you were then allowed into spaces that would seemingly protect you. At the same time, if you were a man and you were traveling separately, independently, you were thought to be resilient and resourceful, and therefore you probably would not actually have those spaces and places that could and ought to protect you. So what would happen in catering to a population that is traditionally understood as vulnerable, all of a sudden, those who would seemingly be less vulnerable become increasingly vulnerable, because the spaces and places where they had to then carve out some measure of an existence actually propel them to have mental health challenges, physical health challenges, and the like. So there's a need to problematize in these spaces what we understand as being vulnerable, and how that vulnerability plays into the way in which the boundaries are erected in those spaces. The other thing that we found quite challenging was the fact that women, to enter into these spaces, if they thought they were under threat, if they'd had experiences of sexual violence towards them, it was the burden of proof to enter into these vulnerable spaces lied on the woman to prove that this event had happened. It was not taken as a foregone. Rather, if you articulate that you are under threat or that you are worried and don't feel safe, not until something has happened and you can prove it are you considered and classified as vulnerable. So there is a different iteration and a different way of thinking about personal safety and the provision of safety and where that responsibility lies. So these are some of the things that we talk about in the paper. The other thing that we talk about in the paper is, and another idea that we draw on quite heavily, is Audre Lorde's concept of the erotic. And we use this chiefly because of the way in which she negotiates chaos. She goes on to say in this particular essay that the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt, distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. Now, initially, whenever I present this paper or use this concept of the erotic, there's a flurry and flutters in the room. But what is really interesting about this particular concept is not just the way in which her notion of vulnerability aligns with someone like Avatar Bra when she's talking about diasporic spaces, but also the potential for relationship building that comes out of it. Because one thing that we noted, and what the paper tries to do, is tie in these various types of how we conceptualize relationships and how relationships are governed in these spaces. Because if you leave the formal spaces of the refugee reception centres and you go into the informal spaces like what they call the jungle on Samos or the Olive Grove in Moria camp, and there's a different type of community that is coming out. Now, I can't speak with first-hand knowledge of what happens in Moria, but I can tell you what happens on Samos, having been there for a little bit of time, and Gemma has since gone back since the February trip. There's a different type of community ethos that comes out in those spaces. You have it coming through in acts of solidarity with the activists and the volunteers who are on the ground supporting them. You also have communities of relationships coming together and supporting each other. And you find these micro-communities emerging. So for example, there was a community of women that went around that particular space and collected €1 from everybody who wanted to participate. They then went to the local grocery store. They made food for themselves. They had home-cooked, well-nourishing food, and they made a profit as well. And this is important and interesting when you contrast it, because it's the exact same space. It is the Greek military that is providing food for the refugees. It's not being eaten because it is not nourishing, it is not sustaining. So there's the dietary requirement element of that, but there's also a security element to it, because to get the food, you have to queue from anywhere from 2 to 5 hours. So by the time you've had one meal and gotten your food, you have to start all over again. So that means if you have appointments to meet with people to talk about your hearing, if you have to see a medical person, like any of these other appointments deny you the opportunity to queue for the food. And if you're in these spaces, you see it just lining the channels beside the camps, because nobody eats it. So it's these ideas and these expressions of solidarity that come through in this concept of the erotic. Now, she roots it in sisterhood, and it's prefaced on difference as well. So there's a direct challenge to their notion of order and their presentation of chaos that gives us a different way of thinking through problems of vulnerability, precarity, and the ethical challenges that go along with understanding what is happening on the ground through the governance and the creation of these reception centres. These pictures, this is a tree that is found within the organisation is called Still I Rise. They run a school for refugee, unaccompanied minors and refugee children on the island of Samos. And on the other side is Alpha Center, which is with Samos volunteers, and they provide various language classes, dance classes, exercise, computer classes, sewing courses. And I guess I'll close here, because what you see in these centres is community, and what you see is solidarity, and it challenges the way in which the policies of the reception centres are being put in place. So if you go to Alpha, it has since changed since I left, and Gemma could probably speak more to this, but while we were there, on a Saturday, it is a women's only space, and they do dancing, and there's sometimes children are allowed. The rules fluctuate from time to time, but you see the beneficiary population coming together, you see the activist community coming together, and they are supporting each other, and they are carving out a life in a situation that would otherwise be considered non-humane. And there's something to be said about how we contest that, how we problematize, not that situation, how we contest the structures that try and inhibit that from happening. And that is why we felt compelled to go to these particular feminist theories. And I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gemma, would you like to?
Yes, am I next?
Yes.
Okay, give me a nudge when I get to like 12 minutes, because I'm not so good at the timekeeping. Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad to be able to talk to you about this paper. So, similarly to Amanda, this is also a co-authored piece with Amanda and 2 of our other colleagues as well, who work on this project, IR Aesthetics, and as she said, that we as a collective have been going to the Balkan Routes, as they're known, from 2017 onwards, but the paper has its origins in 2015 with one of our colleagues, Gemma, started this particular research then. And what I want to talk to you about today is our conception of how we can understand housing and support in urban hubs. We come at this by drawing on the work of Dick Etch and his term, the Badlands, and the idea of the Badlands. And he talked about that in the sense of Paris and areas of the Parisian, the broader Parisian community that were turned into these Badlands as they have become to be known through policy and urban policy. And we wanted to use this concept to then think about what is deemed to be the right way to house refugees and what has been established as or understood by border management authorities and states as the wrong way. And we want to problematise that because I and we would argue that the thing that is deemed to be the good way to do this is actually not particularly good. And that's where this paper starts from. And in particular, we contrast reception and identification centres and refugee camps with urban squats. And in particular, squats are often found in Athens and the Exarchia region, and they're going to be the ones that I'm going to focus on a little bit. And I'm going to contrast this to reception and identification centres and camps in Serbia, Athens, Thessaloniki, and then on the islands of Chios, Lesbos and Samos. So this is the kind of premise for what we're talking about. And in doing this, we don't just draw on the concept of the Badlands, we also look at race, space and place, and othering practices as a way to think about these questions. How EU policy can lead to a situation, not necessarily just EU policy, so both EU, national and local policies can lead to a situation in which certain areas of a city or certain areas of a non-urban space are crafted and left to one side, and the effect that this has on the people who are forced to live in them and the people who are moved into them as well. So, I just want to start by giving a little bit of context about the current situation in particular with regards to the squats in Athens. So I don't know how much people follow the situation in Athens, in particular since the change of government towards new democracy in July 2019 and the effects of that. But throughout 2019, Greek police have raided and evicted a number of the central Athenian squats. These squats are occupied, self-managing and autonomous, and they've often been used to house refugees as well. The evictions of these informal housing providers have led to destitution for some people, in particular refugee families, and some of them have found themselves sleeping rough in Syntagma Square. Others have been moved to a camp that was 50 miles outside of Athens, that when they arrived wasn't even completed. So they were moved from these squats, often at dawn, woken up by police raids, evicted and taken on buses without being given the opportunity to not do this, and moved to a camp. And these are just some of kind of dozens of informal housing locations that had helped to accommodate recently arrived refugees. And they were always located in areas that often have a history of squatting. Exarchia in particular has this association with left-wing movements, with anarchist movements as well. And they provided an alternative. And as a result of providing an alternative form of housing, they were targeted by local interventions, such as inspections, such as demolitions, and such as raids, as I've just mentioned. Sometimes they were aimed at pushing the squat residents into formal refugee housing, so into reception centres and camps. And that is often the narrative. And there were some quite horrendous statements made during this time about cleaning up Exarchia, which obviously comes with lots of horrendous connotations. But there was an underlying desire here to move people into what was deemed to be the right kind of housing. And this is not, supposedly, informal housing. So we argue then that the narratives of the urban badlands and this idea of seeing squats as a badland versus the correct kind of formal housing purported a certain level of criminality of places. It imagined that these places were criminal, whether or not that were the case. It legitimised encampment policies, it legitimised the choice to raid these places under the guise of moving these squat residents from unsafe conditions to the safer conditions, the imagined safety of the RIC. And I'm sure, as you saw from Amanda's pictures, these are not safe locations that people would feel comfortable and safe within, these reception centres. And a lot of these things, there are two sides to this then. So policies create spaces, and spaces then create policies. So the imagination of what these spaces were has led to policy decisions, but the policy decisions have also established a situation in which these spaces were thought of differently and have created this idea of them being less than ideal. So in setting out our arguments, we draw on our experiences in these spaces and our visits to these spaces to demonstrate how naming policies, how spatial discussions, how discussions of place and race affect the way that people think about particular places and spaces. And we do this in the context of a route that is often referred to as the Balkan Route, and the knowledge about the naming policies that come from the broader discussion of the routes as well. And in the paper we go into a lot more detail about that, borrowing from a number of different scholars, but due to the 15 minutes I'm going to focus purely on the discussion of the various different housing locations. So, reception and identification centres are often thought of to be the same. They're often assumed that they would be universalised. They're often funded by the European Union. They're predominantly funded by the European Union, and they share the same name. But in different locations, both within one country, within Greece, or between different countries in Serbia and Greece, the experiences of people living within them differ greatly. And policy decisions claiming to improve a specific area, claiming to move people to spaces that are safer for them, can in fact have a negative impact upon these spaces and on the lives of people within them. So our research kind of challenges this assumption of the safety of refugee camps and contests the assumed negativity of alternative informal housing. And one of the important ways to come to this is even simply to think about the naming choices. So the naming choice of a reception centre, they're often referred to as first reception centres. And that in and of itself is intentional and politicised. So in Serbia, for instance, officials told us that they avoid the use of the word camp. So they don't want these places to be called camps, specifically avoid using the word camp. And the reason they do this is quite an obvious one. The notion of a camp is deeply connected to colonial history, it's deeply connected to totalitarian states, and it's deeply connected to a way of encamping human beings. So what they have in common and what various different versions of the camp have in common is this invariable system of control or of governance. And against this background, the fact that there is an avoidance of using the word camp actually tells us an awful lot. Particularly because of the fact that there is a recognition that it could be thought about in those terms. Similarly, the term reception, it suggests temporality, right? Like if you think about reception, you don't think that you're going to be there for a very long time. But these spaces are only intended to house people for short periods of time. That is true. Like these spaces are not built to house people long term. But the reality is that since the EU-Turkey deal, and here we then see the role of policy in crafting certain spaces, people spend multiple years in these spaces. People on the islands of Samos, Lesbos, Chios can find themselves there for 18 months, 2 years or longer. These spaces were not designed or built to cope with long-term residency. And again, the naming of reception pushes back against that. It helps us to pretend that that is not the case. So the indefinite amount of time that people are now having to spend in RICs defies this notion of reception and temporality. And it correlates with broader global trends by which seemingly temporary camps are now being used as long-term or permanent fixtures. So that's one thing, the naming of these spaces. But also if we think about the conditions in which people find themselves, and Amanda pointed towards this quite a lot. Former refugee camps and RICs, the conditionality in them varies greatly. And a lot of this has to do with the policies that force people to be in certain spaces for longer than others. So for example, in some of the camps and reception centres in Serbia are now a lot less full than they originally were. And the reason that this happens is because that new areas of the so-called route open up as borders are closed, as different parts of it are closed off, as violence that people face on borders increases, or as the EU-Turkey deal forces people to stay on the islands. So in 2015, when people were moving more fluidly, when people were not spending 2 years on the island, some of the camps in Serbia were actually quite overcrowded. However, now in contrast, these camps are actually quite spacious, there is enough room and enough services for people to live a better existence within them. And so again, we see the effect of policies on the creation and change of space, and the effect of policies that were not necessarily intended to have an effect in this particular way. The EU-Turkey deal was not supposed to lead to a camp in a particular part of an area being more or less crowded. These are knock-on effects that occur. Similarly, we see other situations that have an effect in this way. So, for example, in spring this year, the population on Samos got to a point where the Greek government and the broader EU community felt that the population was far too large. It is now a lot larger, and very little has been done to improve that. But rather than setting in place a long-term solution to this, people were being moved from the island of Samos to the island of Kos. So there was a choice to simply move people between one place and another, not to move people onwards, but the decision reflects a course of action to diffuse congestion and in some ways to alter the aesthetic that is being created. So if you're arguing that camps are supposed to be the right place to keep people, the right place to house people, the right place for people to change their lives and have an opportunity at a different life, then you want it to look better. You want to be able to say that the conditions are better. So moving people prevents camps from being called the Badlands, which, if you look at how you would think about it in the media and the representation of particularly places like Moria, you would start to question that. You would question whether or not this is the right way to support human beings. 2 minutes. Okay. Right, well, in contrast to that then, let's talk a little bit more about squats. So, if refugee camps then are presented through policy making as being safe and appropriate, informal housing or squats are presented as the opposite of that. In the same way that the Parisian suburbs were treated by Dicketch, we can see this very much with the usage of squats, in particular Exarchia. And by financially supporting reception centres and other types of official refugee accommodation, the EU national and local authorities curtail or ban aid provision outside of these spaces, and they do this in a number of ways, and particularly through requirements for healthcare and access to things like that. So the difference in attitudes and approaches between squats and formal housing problematises this idea, because they share a number of common problems that govern mobility and access to space. So, for instance, if you want access to the Greek healthcare system, a squat address is not accepted as an address of residency to have access. If you're going for emergency healthcare, this is different, the rules are different. But if you want longer term healthcare access, you can't use the address of a squat. Residents of squats also don't have access to the asylum service, to financial support, to provided food and water. So the choice to live outside of the formal system prevents you from having access to the things you will need for support. So the policy there and the choices there drives people further into formal forms of housing. And again, we see this as governance at a distance. So just to close then, whilst official rhetoric argues that camps and RICs offer a safer, better housing space for those seeking asylum, we argue, and I argue here, that this is in fact not the case. This is not to suggest that all squats and all forms of informal housing are perfect, nor is it to suggest that they are always properly supported and always better than the situations in formal camps. But what it is to suggest is that activist-led alternatives, whilst facing their own issues, are often better than the situation people find themselves in inside overcrowded RICs, and in particularly on the islands of Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Kos and Laros. Because official spaces suffer from overcrowding, they suffer from poor conditions, bad sanitation, and they're often geographically located in areas that prevent people from having access to schools, prevent people from having access to city centres, from NGOs, which actually goes against European policy. So European policy requires access to schools, to healthcare. Lots of these camps don't meet that, whereas actually central squats are a lot better located and have a lot better access in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Myriam? Thank you very much, CISOX, for inviting us, and thanks to Foteini and Jesse and Julie as well for all the logistics. Greatly appreciated. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm trying to address some work that has been on the back burner for a few years now. I wish I had a co-author. I mean, I'm actually finished writing this if I had one, but somehow teaching always takes over. My own work has been on ethics of hospitality, so even though I'm an international relations scholar, have always had a more theoretical approach, let's say, to my work. So this is one of the cases where I'm trying to engage with more empirical work, let's say. I'm teaching on securitization and migration at the University of Leicester, so through my teaching and research, I have looked at the increasingly repressing narrative, both scholarly and political, concerning migratory fluxes. And I see specifically how, in the European space, but also elsewhere, we have tighter border controls, investment in high-tech surveillance techniques, the localization of borders, the externalization of their management, and while we're looking at this criminalisation, let's say, of the refugee crisis, in quotation marks, we can see a variety of figures are brought into sharp relief that in a way reveals a lot about the duties and the responsibilities both of citizens towards foreigners, how these are understood and how they are securitized. And it was quite interesting that among these figures, you know, either irregular or undocumented migrants or refugees, bona fide or asylum seekers, somehow the figure of the people smuggler, the migrant smuggler, seem to be treated in a very monolithic, if I can say, way, so with little nuance. So everyone seemed to agree that this is a solely highly profitable illicit activity, smuggling I mean, with a relatively low risk of detention, hence attractive to criminals. And I was very interested in that, and I would like to inquire into it, why this kind of what I thought was very limited understanding. So we see both in public discourse, but also in scholarship, at least until 2015, a kind of a binary or dichotomy, if you wish. So on one hand, we have brutal smuggling networks, and on the other hand, we have unfortunate migrants that are vulnerable, often, you know, prey to the smuggling network. So a binary of predator and victim. And I think this kind of dichotomy does contribute to a lot of issues that actually fuel mass smuggling. So first of all, it doesn't look at the role and responsibility of states in the creation of mass smuggling networks. Does not look how individual and collective strategies towards mobility adapt and adjust under the increasing securitization of border control that I mentioned earlier. And also it does not explain how human migration, either regular or irregular, does reflect the obstacles created by border enforcement and does not necessarily reflect migrants' preferences. Also, I found that this account of organized crime, we say that this a lot in the media, that this is a transnational crime where mafias and unlimited profits are made, somehow does not reflect, they are ineffective portrayals of the lived experience of migrants and also people implicated in these practices. So this idea of clandestine migration or mobility being an entrepreneurial business venture is not only problematic, I argue in the article, because it dehumanizes migrants, but also is quite inaccurate, especially if we see the research and the scholarship from 2016 onwards. So empirical research in the field does not substantiate it necessarily. My argument, I will be making towards the end is that the criminalisation of migrant smuggling is unethical, and I will explain why towards the end, and it's definitely ineffective, and that's very easy to prove. The third part of the argument, still working on it because I need to talk perhaps with more lawyers, but I'm trying to look how there are already laws at the international and also national level that address any criminal acts happening during smuggling and during smuggling. A disclaimer is that I'm not dismissing or trivializing the inherent violence that we know and happens while people are smuggled across borders. For instance, one cannot ignore what's happening right now in Libya or other places, detention camps. We have a lot of evidence around that. But what I'm arguing in the paper is that this kind of violence, the exacerbation of this kind of violence, is a result of the criminalization of smuggling in the first place. I would also like to add that it's very difficult to actually build a homogeneous profile of the smuggler. I do think it's not this traditional stereotype promoted, I just mentioned the transnational criminal network. We do see in empirical research that very often they are members of family or tribe and next of kin. They sometimes, migrants suggest that they see them as helpers, definitely as service providers, in a way a necessary evil in quotation marks. And I think the fact that smuggling still goes on despite great effort to shut it down, and the same thing with migration flows, especially towards the European Union, this resilience suggests that there's a moral economy there that one has to inquire into before falling into these binaries I mentioned earlier. Looking into migrant smuggling, there is a variety of issues. First of all, until very recently, we had very limited empirical data and research, and the data we had was really rather fragmented, and I think that actually is not so surprising. The data on migrant smuggling in Europe are only partially available. There's quite divergence among different states on how they gather they collect this data. This limits our ability to fully comprehend the scale and dynamics behind the crime. In principle, official data on migrant smuggling are collected or are based on apprehensions. So the majority of things we know by the people that have been arrested. And the suggestion is that we only arrest a very small percentage of actual smugglers. So it's collected by national law enforcement agencies like the police, Coast Guard, border authorities. We also have national call records, and these provide the primary source of information on migrant smuggling. So we also have stuff from the European Union agencies like Frontex and Europol, some data through surveys. But again, the majority of statistics or statistical figures do come from these, really problematic data. So the statistics, are based on problematic data. So one should take the statistics with a pinch of salt. So they are largely based on estimates, which very often do not seem to be very accurate. Another issue is that smuggling is actually a relatively new crime. So the link between irregular migration and smuggling is not as long as established as it appears to be. That starts around the mid-1990s in Europe during the first major refugee crisis. Up until then, migrant smuggling was neither punished nor treated as an important act of crime as it is today. It even had a positive connotation, smuggling Jewish people out of, during the Second World War out of Germany, or later on people from the USSR for political, ideological reasons. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, that this is new crime, and I'm arguing in the article later on that perhaps it's a crime that results in more crimes taking place in a way, or attracting more criminals.
I'll spend a few minutes later if I have the time with more detail on that. Legislation, anti-smuggling legislation also is quite diverse. So we have the UN smuggling protocol from 2000 and the EU Facilitators Directive from 2002. They have some kind of discrepancies. Perhaps I don't have the time, I should mention that it's about the humanitarian clause. So the European definition has a clause about humanitarianism. So if you can prove that you have smuggled someone for humanitarian reasons, perhaps you could be acquitted. However, this is up to the states to decide if they will. It's not an obligatory clause. So another issue is the financial gain. In some cases, financial gain does play a role. In some other cases, between UN and the EU, they do not agree on that. What's even worse is that there's a lot of discretion given to the states of how they apply this kind of legal frameworks. And so we see a lot of differences how the same, state members of the European Union applying same laws quite differently. So this overbroad definition, scholars suggest, and I also argue in my article, is not accidental. I think it does have to do with the fact that the criminalisation of smuggling actually is a deterrence tool. I have 2 minutes already. Okay. Okay. Let's walk you through my slides then. So, yes, Balkan Route. So, why it's relevant to what we do today. Same issues apply for the research on the Balkan Route. Actually, it's even worse. There's even less data. We only have an article from 2018 and a very good report from 2019. All of them say, well, smuggling is not being very well documented. There's a lot of conflation between smuggling and trafficking that happens a lot on the public discourse, as we see in the media, but some scholarship has the same issue. I was not going to go through that, but I just wanted to show or underline with bold the differentiation between the various legal frameworks. And here I have the US one, for instance, which is not relevant to our topic today, but here financial gain is treated in a quite different way. I don't have the time to give you a few examples, but we have discrepancies in the European Union as far as the smuggling is concerned. So Austria, France, Greece, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK follow a very broad definition, penalize the facilitation of entry irrespective of the financial gain involved. Germany and Belgium have financial gain as an additional requirement. So the same happens with the humanitarian clause, for instance. Type and severity of punishment also is quite different. It can be a fine, it can be 1 to 2 years imprisonment in Austria, Germany, and Spain, 10 years in Greece, 14 years in the UK. So again, we see a lot of divergence among different states. The territorial scope is quite interesting. You can actually be considered a smuggler even for moving someone within your country, so no crossing, no borders. We have, I'm sure you know some of these examples, right? We have this, up to 2015 in Lesbos, we had a bus driver that gave someone a ride, even though these people actually have to register, so they have to get to the reception centers to register. So that suggests they have to walk 40 kilometers from where they land. Still, giving a ride, even as a bus driver, people would be fined. In my article, I engage a lot with this Danish case. We talk about a couple that actually they were well versed in the law. They actually called the police to ask whether they should help move a family of Syrians from the south of Denmark to Copenhagen. They ended up being fined. They appealed. There was a lot of media commotion around it. They were fined even more. So we see how this kind of discretion of states does play a lot to domestic politics and so on and so forth. I know I have already used my 2 minutes, but very fast. Perception of migrants also is very important. They actually, majority of them do not seem to differentiate between border guards and smugglers. They do see them as actors profiting from them, you know. Victimization, I also talk a bit about that. I think it's problematic, you know, the view that they are, you know, migrants are always ill-informed and exploited. I think it's quite problematic. Again, empirical research does not support that. And finally, to my argument, unethical. Why? Because first and foremost, it undermines the ability for people to access protection. It has led to an increase in illegal crossings. I mean, that also happens. You have a fence between Turkey and Greece. People, you know, go through the sea route. You have the EU-Turkey deal. People just move towards the central Mediterranean route, so which is more violent, more legal, and so on and so forth. So we see that this kind of criminalization actually, you know, does lead to violations of human rights of migrants. There's a discussion about moral permissibility, whether something is illegal but moral permissible, traditional ethics. You know, it's very, very interesting discussion. I'm not sure it fills the gap here, but I do engage with it a bit. Ineffective, why? Because we do see trends that, for example, okay, it doesn't reduce the flow of migrants, it doesn't reduce smuggling. So in a way, it's a criminalization that doesn't bear results. Finally, unnecessary crimes committed during smuggling, like money laundering, extortion, abandoning people at sea, allowing them knowingly to board unseaworthy vessels, all of them are covered by international law. So in a way, if we really want to criminalize people doing these things, we have the tools. Sorry for running over.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three of you. Thank you for your insightful presentations and for your nuanced analysis of different aspects of the so-called migration crisis. All three papers addressed questions of agency and structure with an emphasis on speciality. So the space with barbed wired fences and bad locks, etc., or squads in Athens, becomes basically the defining context for the position of these individuals and for the relationships that they build also between them. You have very vividly described the situation in reception centres, whereby in these very special and harsh circumstances, refugees and migrants allow others to, in a way, to lead them and on how they live, and not challenge also the current state of things. In a way, a vicious circle and a system that feeds itself. Reception centres essentially constitute spaces of violence, and by definition, where people cannot lead normal lives, if I could say normal, quote unquote. On the other hand, I would like to say that we are, the wider public in Europe and generally in the Western world, it looks like it has been immunized to the operation of these reception centres. Their very existence is not even bothering. In other words, we are witnessing kind of normalization of the current status of border management, and also the inadequacy of migration management system contributes to the distortion of the wider picture. The smugglers, as Myriam portrayed, are perceived as a cause of the problem, and the particular depiction of smuggling and smugglers is not addressing it as a systemic issue and a side effect of the problematic migration management and asylum system. And also, I would dare to say that we witness a disengagement from the bureaucrats in Brussels, from the reality of the decisions and the acts, or at least these acts that have a consequence in human suffering. And this brings in mind Hannah Arendt, and I don't know if I'm taking it too far by saying, you know, we're witnessing again the banality of evil. In 2011, perhaps it was a lack of knowledge when we encountered all these issues, understanding the situation, not adequately equipped. But in 2020, we see a perpetuation of this dire situation that affects the migrants and refugees, but also the local communities. the day before yesterday, 2,000 Afghan people came into the streets of Lesbos in order to protest for the living conditions. This led to clashes between the locals and the refugees. The hotspot in Moria actually is housing now 20,000 people, whereas the capacity is for 3,000 people. So I would like to ask, especially Amanda and Gemma, that they were in these places, if in all these years that you have done your research, the position of locals has changed regarding migrants and refugees, and to what extent and to what direction? And relatedly, what is your view on closed reception centres, something that the government in Greece is suggesting to re-implement, and which came into the discussion after the incidents of Monday? And also I would like to ask, you in your presentations you portrayed how supranational level policies influence local policies and effectively migrants and refugees. So I would like to ask whether in your experience and your observations you have seen the reverse effect, whether the negative picture of the situation on refugee camps have transformed the policies in any way. So if the demands and pressing needs of the people trapped in these reception centres has shifted the European policy making. And also I'm interested to hear the opinion of Myriam on the new netted barrier that they're going to put in the sea in Greece off Lesbos. That's a plan criticized by the Amnesty International, warning that it would enhance the dangers of asylum seekers and refugees encountered in their attempts to seek safety. And I would very much be interested to hear your opinion. And let's start the discussion, and then I will open for questions to the people. And I would really like to encourage the students to engage into the discussion. So please pose your questions first. So,
do we open it or?
Yes. Let's discuss first the first question.
Go first.
Want me to go first?
I could go first.
Yeah, you can go first.
It's very easy in a way. Sorry. Yes, the net barrier is going to be 3 kilometers long apparently. I don't know. Actually, I think I read somewhere in order to actually do it properly, it will cost, I don't know, 30 billion euros, you know, exactly what Greece needs. Yes, I think that's an example of this, securitization techniques I mentioned at the beginning, that in a way just push the problem down, kick the can down the road. I mean, I don't think they were going to be effective. It's going to be a deterrence tool, It will just mean riskier business, which probably will attract proper criminal networks. So in a way, I think will play perhaps good on domestic political level, for voters and stuff. But it's like the criminalisation of smuggling doesn't really contribute either to the management of migration or to respect of human rights, or even addressing the problem that we have at our hands right now at the EU level or Greek level, not Greek national level. So very
thank you.
Go on then.
Me. Okay. How has the position of locals towards refugees, like that relationship between the local population and the refugee population, changed? I'd say it has significantly deteriorated. I can think specifically, I guess if you look at it from one particular example, let's just say to illustrate one point, schools. Still our eyes exist because the idea of having the children who live in the reception centres in the local schools was not one that was seen as a viable option in the context of Samos. And I am using that because that is the one that I'm the most comfortable with. I mean, there were problems obviously of inoculation, and the children need to be inoculated, but plans were put in place to allow that to happen, and even then that didn't happen. So children do have access. At the point in which I was asking these questions, things could have changed. I haven't followed up since last February, so you should probably come in on this because you've been back. But children were only allowed in those spaces when the local resident population were not in them. So in that sense, I think the relationship is deteriorating. And then I can, one of the conversations I had, someone talked about how, like on the island of Samos in particular, there was almost no crime rate. It was a very open island. People left their doors open. There was one break-in that anybody had been made aware of, and that changed the narrative, and that changed the feeling of security on the island as well. And there was a move towards a negative conversation around the refugee population. What about closed reception centres? Well, from the perspective of accountability and the paper that we're writing, I think that's a terrible idea, simply because you need to be able to witness this, although saying that, witnessing doesn't seem to do much good at the moment, bearing in mind the point you made about the difference between 2011 and 2020, and not much seems to have changed. And I think that the trickier part of all of this is that in trying to extend these findings beyond the academic community and say engage with people who can allow for a protest or some sort of discomfort to emerge in the wider population, the stories that we want to talk about and the stories that we want to tell, we're told aren't even newsworthy. So in that sense, it's tricky, and that feeds into the final question about is there a reverse effect? You know, can local policy shift the supranational? While the final week on Samos in February 2019, there was tension, there were riots, and we were there to witness them. And I have yet to see any change based on the outcome of that. You might have more to add to that.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Is it okay? May I? Foteini?
Yes, of course.
I'm thinking, what about the UNHCR? I mean, is it because we tend to suggest it's EU or it's the Greek state's problem, but do you have a feeling about the kind of institutional responsibility there, or no? Okay.
I think one of the problems that UNHCR has is that they can't keep staff for very long.
Yeah.
So there is a huge turnaround of UNHCR staff in these spaces. So that you don't have this long-term overview, you don't have this long-term knowledge, and the people don't have the experience necessarily. This is not to criticise UNHCR broadly, although there are things to criticise, but this particular situation of people being in the field and on the ground, if you've only got 3 months knowledge and experience, this isn't enough, because you can't track people's lives either. So if you're working with unaccompanied minors, for example, and you are their guardian, or you are the person who is keeping an eye on them, then you need to know where they're going next. And if your role changes, then you don't have that ongoing relationship. So you find that people who work outside of the state, NGOs, step in to fill the gap because they're actually there for longer. So people who aren't being paid and who aren't supported by international money can spend longer in these spaces. And that just doesn't make sense. Like, we should be ensuring that UNHCR has a long-term presence so that they can have a long-term effect.
And I think, to follow on that, one of the things that we're trying to do in the accountability paper is to say within that relationship there is a very specific need to be talking about those particular communities, because they are filling, not only are they filling a really important gap, but there's also the narrative that within that community, the narrative has changed since we've been engaging with it. And so now they're actively speaking about burnout and how much longer we can go on filling that need. And if the state isn't going to be providing for these functions, and then the third sector isn't providing these services as well, there is going to be a genuine problem that, I mean, if we think it's bad now, it's going to get that much worse.
Thank you very much. Questions from the audience, please?